So today I'm taking a look at one of the newest releases from Tissot, and that is the 35mm PRX with the Powermatic movement now. I've already taken a look at the quartz version, so you can go watch that video if you'd like, but let's take a closer look at this one. So we have a diameter of about 34.8, effective lug to lug of about 44.1, actual lug to lug closer to 40mm. We have a height of 11.2, and the bracelet tapers from about 24 down to 16. Some other general specifications for this watch, we're going to have the Powermatic 80 movement beating away in here, which is, in-house-ish, kind of used all over the Swatch group. On the front, we do have a sapphire crystal, sapphire on the back as well. They do state they use some kind of AR coating, but they don't really state whether it's on the inside or the outside, so it's somewhere. We do have Superluminova for the hands and the indices. What is nice is they lean fairly white. They're not too creamish or green, so that's a nice touch there. Have 100 meters of stated water resistance, but this is just a regular push-pull crown, so we're really just relying on the gaskets there. And last but not least, the watch retails directly from Tissot for $695. So starting off with the dial of this watch, and I think Tissot did a really good job here. We do, of course, have this pseudo tapisserie style pattern here. It's really just a bunch of squares all over the dial, more like a grenade type dial. I guess you can say, whereas the actual AP that it's kind of based off of has this more swirly guilloche pattern underset into it, where this is literally just raised squares. We do, of course, have this very beautiful shade of dark green. It has a very slight sunburst effect that you can see at certain angles or in certain lighting situations, but it is a pretty subtle application, which I do like. It's not too aggressive. And really, at some angles, the dial almost goes blackish, which is a very dark, deep forest green. So it lets the kind of case finishing shine a little bit more and take not all your attention away from the bracelet. Looking a little bit more generally, we do have these rectangular markers for all the indices, a very small marker here at the 3 because the date takes up most of it, double marker at 12, and a similar shape, just larger for the handset. Feels very cohesive, feels nice, it looks good. I don't think it's at odds with the dial design in any way, and maybe like the Christopher Ward 12 did feel to me. So this is a really good dial design. The markers themselves are also multifaceted. So you have a little bit of a cut down on each side of the index, which leads to a little bit of shininess. To be fair, it's a fairly small, actual metal surface, so you don't get a lot of reflectiveness. It doesn't feel overly crazy popping in your face, but it does have a nice little subtle shine to it, which isn't over dramatic, I guess you could say. The text is kept both minimal and symmetrical. We have Tissot 1853 at the very top and PRX Powermatic, 2 lines at the top, 2 lines at the bottom. Really symmetrical, looks good, and really I don't think they could have done anything better. Something I really do like about this watch is they created a lot of depth with the hour hands, or just the handset in general, because you have this almost channel in between the 2 sides of the hand itself, which creates not only depth, but it's finished with a brushed finish, so it really just pops. It feels very architectural, and it really is just an attention to detail point where they didn't have to take this extra step. They could have had a flat 2-dimensional hand and still done a fairly good job. But this application, this execution gives it so much more of a premium feel that I really enjoy just looking at the handset, and they feel very functional and feel at home on the watch. So taking a look at the dial in natural light, when it's shaded, you have this nice deep dark green that really almost leans black. And then of course the bracelet is really the star of the show, the way the links come to life and go from black to silver to whitish depending on the angle. It looks amazing. When you get into direct sunlight, the dial pops out more, becomes a little bit more of the focus of the show, that green popping out much more. Again, back in the shade. Really it's the bracelet and the case that are drawing your attention. The dial is very subtle, not even really seeing the green that much, but it's kind of there. In somewhat shaded lights, you can kind of see the green pops out just slightly, but again, it's still a very, very subtle color. In direct light, of course, again, dial pops out, the green's very vibrant, the sunburst pattern pops out more, and again, it is a good looking watch, both in direct sunlight and in shade, which is hard to do. So zooming in on the dial here, and you can see how pretty nice it looks up close. We do have the text done on a little bit of a placard, I guess you can say, above the dial. It has a little bit of a raised off appearance. The text itself has a good amount of 3-dimensionality. It's done in this pure white tone and just looks pretty premium overall. The actual base pattern you can see has this pretty good depth to it. It actually raises up off the dial. There's little channels in between each one of those squares, and the squares themselves do rise up off the dial pretty nicely. Again, there is no extra pattern. There's just no brushing effect, or there's no guilloche effect or anything like that. It just is a kind of square stamped dial. And not to say it's not good looking, it has a beautiful amount of color depth. It has this almost gentle metallic sheen, I would say, because of that sunburst effect to it. Looking at the markers, like I was mentioning earlier, we have that multifaceted nature with the 2 polished sides and the brushing section in between, and then a fairly big amount of lume, which is nice because it kind of ties into the white starkness of the seconds track and feels very cohesive there. But I also do think they maybe went a little bit far with the lume signature. It just feels like there's a lot of lume to marker ratio. I feel like they maybe could have brought that up a little bit, but not too big of a deal. Of course, QC-wise, nothing's perfect. We do see there's like a little bit of fuzziness here, depending what angle you look at the marker at. But overall, because there's such a small surface area, there isn't really a lot of area for blemishes to occur. And realistically, I think most of the markers are finished with pretty good standard. There's nothing glaring or I think that is seemingly out of place on this dial. Even the date window is done really cleanly. It has a nice amount of depth. You have that little bit of a kind of silver dusted finish leading into the actual dial, and the polish on the outside looks good and follows in with the rest of the theme of the dial. Looking at the handset itself, you can see there are like maybe a little small blemish here and there, that tiny little scratch on the right hand side there. But overall, they're done really cleanly. Again, you do have the same kind of feel you do with the marker. You have the polish on the outside edges, you have the brushing in the middle, and then you have, of course, a little bit of lume infill. So you have a nice amount of depth to the marker itself. If we go at like an off angle like this, you can see that the brushing section actually dips down between the 2 polished sides. So there's depth to the actual handset, which is something you almost wouldn't expect at this price. I would say, of course, they're maybe not the most perfectly functional time-telling things because there's no defined sharp point in a sense. It's not perfectly pointing to the time. But you can make it out good enough, right? Realistically, it is one of those things where I prefer this styling of like having all the dial and the markers feel very cohesive rather than making everything sharp and pointed purely for the purpose of having the most intense, perfect time-telling device that tells everything down to the second or the minute, because you can gauge it well enough, and as it stands, I don't think if you introduced sharp points to all the indices or the hands, it would look as good as it does now. Moving on to the case here, and this is of course just the classic PRX case we already know, most people already love, of course just in this smaller size. I will say just because that little bit of added thickness, it does feel a little bit different than the quartz in the same size, but not bad by any means. Of course, even though it's around 11-ish millimeters thick, it hides the thickness well. A lot of the case back holds some height, which is going to sit down into the wrist. The mid case is relatively thin, and then you have a fairly large bezel, which at times, it can look a little bit large in a sense. It can feel like it's raising up off the wrist because of how prominent and bulbous this bezel is, but it's not a bad design aspect. And I also just love the shape of this bezel. You have this gentle dome classic bezel feel around the outside, whereas when you hit down at that angle, it goes to a very vertical, straight face. So it's one of those things where they didn't go for simple shapes. They didn't go for just making the watch as clean cut and as cookie cutter as possible. There are just added details which make it better than you would expect it to be. Following on from that, again, once the bezel rounds over this corner here at the very top, it's a little bit flat. So you do just have a lot of areas where this light's bouncing off, playing, and just really making a pretty premium package. Looking a little bit more generally, we do have mostly brushing here, all vertical brushing on the case top, on the bracelet, these kind of Y-style links, which really catch the light nicely. It has a really good luster to it. And then you just have polished accents. You have a fully polished bezel, you have a little chamfer along the edge of the case here, which doesn't follow into the bracelet, which I think would be a good touch in the future if they wanted to iterate a little bit. You of course do have some polish in the middle of the center links here, so that adds a little bit of flair. Case is completely vertical brushed, and it's nice because it leads into a vertical brushing along the side of the links as well, so it feels very cohesive, feels very planned out. Of course, they'll sign T for the crown there. Open case back as well. It's nothing really to write home about. It's finished really to like the same standard as a unfinished Seiko movement, and you just have a customized rotor there. It mainly is coming to the fact that you're getting that 80 hours of power reserve out of this movement, which is a nice touch. Talking about the crown for a second, we do have a relatively decent crown action, I would say. It's nothing super premium. You do get a little bit of that like gritty resistance feel in a sense. It feels just a little bit unrefined, a little bit screechy at times, but when you actually pull the crown out and you're moving the hands, then it feels buttery smooth. It's a really nice action to actually moving the handset. So that I do really like, but that feel isn't amazing, but it's also an automatic watch, so you're not gonna have to be winding it too often. One thing I really do like about this watch is how gradual that taper is. It isn't like super crazy intense, so it's just like the first 2 or 3 links. It feels planned out correctly in a sense. It doesn't look too weird. It doesn't look top heavy on the wrist or anything like that. So the design and proportion here is really nice. Looking at the clasp, we do have the butterfly deployant here. Not the hugest fan. It never really fits perfectly comfortable on my wrist, but it is nice that they included both these super small links and a full link. So you can get a relatively good fit despite it being a butterfly. And you also do have quick release spring bars as well, so you can put it onto some other straps. I know maybe in the future, Deluxe may also make some straps for the 35. They already do for the 40. In the future, Tissot will probably offer straps because they did that for the 40 before they didn't, and then they started offering more options. So it's one of those things where you will have some strap options in the future, and at least you're not stuck with only the bracelet. So moving on to how this watch wears. Earlier, I was wearing this cool little micro brand from Canada called Branch, or Brancherology, but on the dial it just says Branch. So for reference, this is a 36.5 millimeter. Here we have the Tissot sitting on my 6.5 inch wrist, and you can see proportionally it fits pretty well. It does have that kind of classic tonneau shape where it gets largest in the middle and it really tapers out towards the ends, dramatic sized by the bracelet as well. But it does have a really good shape, a really good feel on wrist. It's comfortable, it doesn't raise up off the wrist too high. I will say it doesn't feel too large. It honestly feels fairly small for its size. It is a 35 millimeter, and realistically, based on my calipers, it's slightly smaller than 35. Just like how I was wearing this 36 millimeter watch earlier, most watches have mostly dial and small bezels, whereas this has pretty small dial and a bigger bezel that's kind of hiding how big the kind of extra metal is in comparison to the dial. If I measure these up really quick, if we're taking just purely the dial diameter, this one's about 28.4, and if I get this guy in, this is closer to 32. So even though this is only about a millimeter bigger, we're getting close to 4 millimeters in difference between the dial sizes. So this, even though it's give or take a 35 millimeter, in my opinion, feels fairly small, and it might take getting some used to some people who aren't used to wearing small watches. On the flip side, if you like small watches, you like the footprint of small watches, this will be almost like a heaven-sent watch, right? The 40 millimeter will be too big for people with small wrists. I have a 6.5 inch wrist and it fits me pretty well. I'd rather go for the 35 than the 40. And then if you have under a 6.5, this will probably be the perfect size for you. I have closer to about a 6 inch wrist here, so you can see it still wears very proportionally really well there. So really 6 inch wrist, 5.5, 5, all those wrist sizes are gonna really like the body and the case and the feel of this size. Looking at it from down the barrel shot, you can see even though it's on the thicker side at around 11 millimeters, it wears supremely well into the wrist. It doesn't really rise up at all. That kind of case back sits inside of the wrist and it effectively eliminates maybe 2 millimeters or so of height. So it realistically wears really well. It doesn't feel like it's rising up too high off my wrist. It feels comfortable. What is really nice in comparison to, say, something like a Royal Oak, or I even believe the Maurice Lacroix Acon, or the Christopher Ward 12, is I really like how rounded the bracelet feel is. The bottom side of the links are super silky. Like, it is a beautiful, it's like buttery feeling. It's like super baby smooth, which is a feel I don't get from many watches. It's really premium feeling. But what's nice is the edges, while they have a little bit of sharpness, it's not nearly as sharp as some of these other bracelets you get from integrated watches. So because the links are small, because they're fairly rounded, because it's so soft on the underneath, you're not getting a lot of digging into the wrist. It's not an uncomfortable watch to wear by any means, and whereas I've worn other integrated watches that have not felt great, this feels great on wrist, and this wears really nicely. Then really quickly, I'm gonna bring in this classic SNK case shape. This is of course a modded dial with this sector feel to it, but interestingly enough, the dial size between the two is about the same. So although this is, I believe, about a 37 millimeter case, and this is a little under 35, it gives a similar feel of wearing to this. If you're used to these smaller dials with big bezels, this won't feel too odd to you, but if you're used to these more classical, larger dials, large bezels, then it might just feel a little bit odd at first, because of course, like even if I compare these two, which are both sector feeling. This is technically the smaller watch, but it wears a lot bigger because the dial's so big. So it's one of those things where if you're not used to it, it might be a shock to you at first with the Tissot, but I think you'll come to like it. Taking a look at the Lume, you can see initially it looks like it glows pretty bright. In person, it's a lot dimmer than it even is here. So the Lume isn't great. The hands are gonna be the brightest part. At least all the indices are actually Lume, so it's visible and readable. But again, not a great application, not a super bright glow, and it does die fairly quickly. Reluming and comparing to the Timex, as you can see, of course, Timex is much more legible, similar color tone between them, but again, the Timex just needs to step up, or not the Timex, the Tissot needs to step up and do just a little bit better on the Lume signature. So pros and cons for this watch specifically, and one of the big pros for me is just I love the construction of the watch itself. The brushing is done very well, the articulation is there, the bracelet and the case have this softness to them, not because it's not machined well, but because it's been taken care of and it actually is comfortable to wear. There's this very silky feel to the watch that you typically don't get at watches at this price point. I think it's also a watch that just brings along a lot of visual interest. You get the well done texture, you get the brushing that's executed well on the watch and really pops and shines even though it's just a brush finish. And you get the integrated bracelet look, which really there aren't many other competitors at this price point, and really even slightly above, that can give you that styling, that feel, that presence on wrist. So it's very unique for that. And lastly, the value on this watch is just fantastic. At $695 retail, and I believe it's $740 or so for the Mother of Pearl version, you're getting a amazingly constructed watch. The bracelet feels well done and the case feels solid. The finishing is done very nicely. You're getting an 80-hour movement that isn't that thick either, which is a really nice touch. And realistically, there isn't much more you can ask for. The finishing is up to par for the price point, if not above what you would expect, and the overall feel on wrist is fairly high quality. And my last pro that I'll harp on is just it is great value. At $695 retail, at least for this version, you're getting an amazingly constructed watch. The finishing is done well, the case feel and the way it wears is just amazing, and the dial's not too shabby either. I would like to see a little bit more variation. Most of them are pretty safe, I would say, outside of the Mother of Pearl. A little bit of a darker tone to most of the dials. With that being said, I'm sure more variations will come out in the future, and that will just make this line even more enticing. There aren't many watches at this price point that compete directly in the value you're getting, the 80-hour movement, the construction, the feel, the fit, the finish. You really do have to step up to something like, let's say, a Christopher Ward or even higher to get something similar to this. And it depends on whether or not you like those other brands aesthetically or you like the Tissot more, because again, you're getting a lot of bang for buck here. So moving on to cons for the watch, and I think this will be an important point for many people, and it's the fact that the 35mm PRX is a little on the small side, but even for me, the 40mm is a little bit big. So I do think a lot of people will find themselves not necessarily liking the smallness of the 35 and maybe not preferring the bigness of the 40 and maybe wishing there was a 37 or a 38mm version to kind of bridge the gap. I do think a 5mm difference is pretty drastic, and I guess you could say, and there will be some people, I assume, that will fall in the middle and not like either version. I would say if you can err on the side of the 35 and just make that one work, just go for it. It's not bad having a smaller watch. It ends up being classier, fits under cuffs better. There's not really many downsides as long as it still looks proportional with you. Another con, at least for me, and you can definitely tell by the wall here, is the fact that this watch doesn't really have strap options along with it. There is, of course, Deluxe, which made strap options for the 40mm PRX, but to be fair, I didn't really even like those options. And there is one brand, and if I remember what they are, I'll link it down below or I'll have it on screen, that makes a connecting link that lets it take standard with straps, so that's actually pretty cool. But because that integrated bracelet styling, you can't get regular third-party straps. You have to kind of rely on Tissot making first-party ones, and because it's Tissot and they're not necessarily a super high-end luxury brand, the quality of the strap probably won't end up being great. It might be like a $50, $60, $70 strap that they made for like $5, and it's not great quality, right? So it kind of just sucks you can't mix up the watch a little bit. I would love to see some rubber options, especially with the kind of sportiness of this watch or the sport capability of this watch, but at the moment it doesn't exist. And my last real con for the watch is I just think the Lume is pretty bad. It's very thin, it's not very bright, it doesn't last very long. They could have done a much better job or not even included it at all and maybe just added more facets to the watch, which I think people would have liked. it's kind of just there. It's nothing crazy. I don't really use Lume overly much anyway, so it's not a deal breaker for me, but if it is for you, not great Lume here. So final thoughts on this watch, and I do really like it. I do think it's a fantastic option to have the automatic at both the 40 and the 35mm size rather than just having a 40 quartz, 40 automatic, and 35 quartz. It shows that, you know, Tissot listened to the people. The 35 obviously sold well enough to make a automatic version viable, and I do think it's going to be a very great option for a lot of smaller wristed people out there, especially because I don't think there's not a lot of really good, you know, sub 40, even sub 38mm options for people who like that sizing. Again, like I mentioned earlier, if you have about a 5.5, 5, maybe even 4.5 inch wrist, this will probably fit you perfectly. This will be like it's made for you. And that's nice. It's now not alienating a lot of people who maybe liked the design of the 40, but it just couldn't work out for them. Even me at a 6.5 inch wrist, I liked the 40, I just didn't like how it wore at all. It's a little bit flat, so at the smaller size, it works better. There aren't many other integrated bracelet options until you step up to the Christopher Ward 12 or even Maurice Lacroix Acon, and both of those are either 2 to 3 times more expensive than this, and arguably not 2 to 3 times the quality, and fairly similar quality, and all in all, having had hands-on with all of them. And in a lot of ways, I like this Tissot the most out of the 3. Is this the most amazing watch on planet Earth? No, but I think it's amazing for what it is. Similar to how like 5, 6, maybe 7 years ago, I don't really remember at this point, the SARB 033 and 035 were around like $300 or so, and you were getting a lot of value packed in there. It was a good looking watch. It kind of was able to do everything, dress up, dress down, and this is that almost a little bit better. It's not apples to apples, but it's a really refined package. It's decent value. It just, to me, aesthetically looks good. And because you have both the 35 and the 40mm sizes, you'll probably fit most bases for people who want to wear this watch. This could be a fantastic first automatic for someone, a fantastic graduation present, just a fantastic present if you have a good buddy or friend or loved one that's into watches, but you don't want to break the bank, but you want to get them something kind of nice. This is a great option. I don't think too many people will be disappointed with this watch if they buy one or if they get one as a gift, and I do think most people should try to get hands-on with one or try to own one or experience one at some point because it's a good watch. Anyway, those are just my opinions. Thank you as always for watching the video. Hope you got something out of it. Let me know what you think down below, and I'll see you in another one.